an abandoned dog who wouldn't move, a little girl who refused to walk away, and a grandmother whose memories were fading like light through old curtains. No one expected a miracle, but in that quiet cabin, through small acts of love and one silent bark, something sacred began to stir. Proof that sometimes God sends hope not in thunder, but in fur. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments, and if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you? Please give this video a like and consider subscribing. Willow Creek, Montana, late October. Windy, overcast skies. The first breath of snow in the air. The mountain winds pressed hard against the pine ridges of Willow Creek, whispering through brittle leaves and empty fields. Gray clouds hung low, and the chill carried with it the quiet of coming snow. At the edge of town, nestled between faded trail signs and a crooked barbed wire fence, stood a small animal rescue center, its wooden shingles flapping faintly in the breeze. In the far corner of the yard, behind a row of metal kennels, lay a large German shepherd, curled tightly against the cold concrete floor. His name was Maxwell, once spoken with pride during mountain rescue missions. Now barely a whisper. He was 10 years old, with thick sable fur marked by gray along his muzzle, and a body stiffened by time and use. Maxwell did not bark like the younger dogs. He did not paw at the gate or leap for attention. He simply lay there, motionless, surrounded by the yips and howls of pups too young to understand silence. His eyes, dark, weary, stared at nothing in particular, not the gate, not the sky, not the humans passing by. Just a vague, frozen space in the middle distance. He had once pulled hikers from ravines, once slept under stars beside men in orange jackets, once wagged his tail in triumph. But those days were gone, and now he waited for nothing. The gravel outside the shelter crunched as an old station wagon rolled to a stop. The passenger door creaked open, and a small figure stepped out. Emily Green, 6 years old, wore a pink dress under a puffy jacket with flower patches sewn on the elbows. Her strawberry blonde hair peeked out from under a knitted hat with bare ears, and her hands clutched a faded plush bunny. She was small, curious, and unusually quiet for her age, more comfortable watching the world than talking to it. Today, her eyes were full of wonder, darting between kennels and signs as she followed the sound of barking. Trailing behind her was Ruth Green, her grandmother, 69, tall and slender, with silver hair braided loosely over one shoulder. Her steps were slow but deliberate, and she gripped the car keys as if she might forget where they were meant to go. Once a school librarian, Ruth had a quiet dignity, the kind that came from years of cataloging knowledge she could now feel slipping away. Diagnosed with early-onset memory decline, she often forgot names, sometimes days. But she never forgot her granddaughter's smile. They hadn't come to adopt. The stop at the shelter was a spontaneous suggestion from Emily, murmured from the back seat on the drive home. Ruth, tired but never unkind, had nodded. "We're just visiting," she had said softly. The shelter was buzzing. Volunteers moved in and out with clipboards, laughing as puppies scrambled over each other for attention. Emily wandered along the kennels, stopping to wave at every wagging tail, but her pace slowed near the end of the row, where the noise faded and only one dog sat quietly, unmoving. Maxwell. He didn't lift his head as Emily approached, didn't bark, didn't twitch. He looked through her as if she were another shadow passing by, but something in the stillness of his eyes made her stop. Emily crouched down in front of the kennel, her fingers curling around the chain-link gate. She didn't speak. She didn't reach out. She just sat, watching. After a long minute, Maxwell blinked, that was all. Behind her, Ruth caught up and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Darling, let's keep moving. There are plenty of friendlier dogs." Emily didn't move. "I like him." Ruth hesitated. "He's very old." "Sweetheart, he's not loud," Emily replied. "He's just waiting." Ruth looked into the kennel. The dog looked older than she'd expected, graying, gaunt, with a kind of quiet pain that felt too human to name. She swallowed hard. They had no leash, no plan, no supplies. They hadn't come to adopt, but Emily looked up at her with wide, unwavering eyes. And Ruth, despite the flickering gaps in her memory, remembered what it felt like to be needed. And so, she sighed and whispered, "Let's bring him home." Then, the first snow came in quiet layers, dusting the roof of the old log cabin like powdered sugar. It covered the pine needles in the yard and settled into the curves of the garden fence. Out in the woods, the sounds of autumn had faded. No more crunching leaves, no more chirps or rustles, just the muffled hush of winter laying its claim. Inside the cabin, warmth radiated from the old stone fireplace, but in the corners, silence still lingered. Maxwell had been living with Emily and Ruth for nearly 2 weeks. The cabin was small, with uneven wooden floors, hand-sewn curtains, and shelves lined with old books and framed photographs, most of which had begun to fade from both sun and memory, despite the change in surroundings. Maxwell remained the same, quiet, still, distant. He chose a spot beside the fireplace and lay there for most of the day, barely moving except to drink from his bowl or shift positions when the wood crackled too loudly. He didn't bark, didn't wag his tail, didn't chase after toys. The only sound he made was the slow rhythm of his breathing, steady and low like a tired metronome. Emily, in her pink dress and fuzzy socks, made it her mission to be near him. Each morning, after pulling on her wool cardigan with the mismatched buttons, she would sit beside him, a book in her lap. She read aloud, carefully sounding out the words, her voice soft but patient. Sometimes she brought him a cookie from her snack tin, a plain biscuit wrapped in a napkin, or set one of her crayon drawings beside his paw. But Maxwell never reacted. Not even when she traced a heart into the fur on his back with her fingertip. "He's like a statue," Emily said one day. "Some statues are just sleeping." Ruth replied from the kitchen, her voice dreamy and far away. Ruth had her own quiet battles. The days began to blur. On Tuesday, she asked Emily if it was Sunday. On Thursday, she forgot where she'd put the coffee, though it sat in plain view on the counter. Once, she stared at a photograph on the wall, a picture of her and her late husband at a lakeside picnic, and asked, "Was this someone we knew?" Emily didn't correct her. She just smiled and said, "He looks kind," and tucked her hand into Ruth's. Despite the confusion, Ruth still kept her morning routine, a cup of chamomile tea, a quick sweep of the front porch, and a puzzle book she never finished. Her hands trembled more than they used to, and sometimes she paused mid-sentence, as though trying to remember where her thoughts had gone. One afternoon, when the sun cast long golden streaks across the wooden floor, Ruth stood in the middle of the kitchen and looked directly at Emily. "Darling," she said gently, "can you remind me your name?" Emily didn't blink. "It's Emily, Grandma. But you can call me Sweet Pea, like before." Ruth's face shifted, just slightly. "Just enough. Sweet Pea," she echoed, and her lips curved into a thin smile. Maxwell, lying by the fire, turned his head just a little, ears twitching. He didn't lift his body, but his eyes followed Emily as she crossed the room to help Ruth sit down. Then, as if in response to some forgotten instinct, he rested his chin against the floor and sighed. That same evening, they had their first visitor since Maxwell's arrival. Tommy Brinks, the next-door neighbor, knocked on the door with a container of stew and his usual flannel jacket dusted in sawdust. He was in his early 50s, broad-shouldered with a thick beard and a kind face, though his eyebrows were permanently furrowed, as if life had given him too many things to worry about. Tommy ran a small wood shop out of his garage and often stopped by to check on Ruth since her diagnosis. "Brought you something hot," he said as Emily opened the door. "Thought you might not feel like cooking today?" Ruth smiled vaguely. "Well, bless you, Henry." "It's Tommy," he corrected gently, handing her the container. "Of course," she said, not looking at him. Tommy noticed Maxwell lying by the hearth and raised an eyebrow. "New dog?" Emily nodded. "He's old, doesn't play much." Tommy stepped closer, crouching to take a better look. "Well, you're a handsome fella, aren't you?" he murmured. Maxwell didn't move, but his eyes followed Tommy's hand as it hovered in the air, then slowly retreated. "He doesn't bark," Emily said. "He doesn't smile either, but that's okay." Tommy's eyes flicked to Ruth, who was humming to herself in the corner, arranging spoons in a drawer that already had spoons. Then to Emily, who had placed a blanket over Maxwell like a crown. "You're good for each other," he said simply. That night, Ruth forgot to turn off the porch light. Emily reminded her gently. Maxwell watched the girl's small frame tiptoe out into the cold to flip the switch, then come back inside, cheeks pink from the air. The silence remained, but it didn't feel as empty anymore. Maxwell still didn't wag his tail, but the next morning, when Emily placed her usual drawing next to him, this time, a picture of a big dog under a pine tree with a little girl in pink. He shifted closer to her knee and stayed there. It wasn't a smile, but it was something. The days had grown shorter in Willow Creek, and the frost now arrived before breakfast. By the third week of November, the ground held the memory of every footstep, and the trees stood bare like quiet sentinels around the cabin. Snow had not yet fallen again, but the cold bit deeper with each sunrise. Inside the little wooden house, a small kind of rhythm had begun to form, not perfect, not always remembered, but enough to hold the pieces of 3 lives gently together. Emily still wore her pink dress, though now layered over thick tights and a sweater that once belonged to her mother. She had taken to sitting outside on the front porch steps each afternoon with her colored pencils and sketch pad, wrapped in a flannel blanket that dragged along the floor when she moved. Her pictures were mostly of dogs, always the same one, with big ears and sad eyes, and always a little girl standing beside him, wearing a pink dress under gray skies. That week, she drew something different. The girl and the dog stood together under a swirl of rain, puddles forming around their feet. Over the drawing, Emily scrawled in careful block letters, "I'll wait until you smile." She taped the picture to the post beneath the porch roof, using 2 silver star stickers to hold it in place. Then she sat down beside it, legs tucked beneath her, and stared into the quiet woods beyond the clearing. Inside the cabin, Ruth was having a slow morning. She had set the kettle on the stove, forgotten it, then remembered, then forgotten again. She stood by the window, looking out toward the tree line with a teaspoon in her hand and no memory of what she had meant to stir. Her cardigan hung loosely from one shoulder. The soft silver of her hair caught the light as she turned to the sound of the door creaking open. It was Maxwell. The old German shepherd stepped cautiously into the hallway, his nails clicking softly against the floorboards. His gait remained slow, slightly uneven on the left side where stiffness still lingered. But today he did not return to the fireplace. He paused near the doorway, then turned his head toward the porch. Emily was outside, without a sound. Maxwell padded forward. Out on the porch. Emily was humming. Not a song. Exactly. Just a quiet tune she made up as she went, dipping and rising with the wind. Her hands were streaked with crayon, and her sketchpad lay open beside her. Maxwell stepped into view and sat down beside her. He didn't lie flat this time. He sat up, tall and straight, his shoulder barely touching hers. Emily turned her head slightly but didn't speak. She didn't want to startle whatever miracle had wandered toward her. Then, so slowly she thought she imagined it. His tail moved, not a full wag, just a tremor. A shift, like the beginning of something almost forgotten. Emily smiled. Not with her mouth, but with her whole body. She reached down and rested her fingers gently on his back. Inside, Ruth stood frozen by the window, watching the two of them in silhouette against the pale sky. Her gaze softened, and she stepped forward, setting the spoon on the windowsill. She walked slowly to the door, her slippers silent against the floor, when she opened it. Maxwell turned his head. Ruth stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to place him in a memory she couldn't quite reach. Then she said, clearly and without hesitation, "Maxwell, would you like to come in?" Maxwell stood, walked to her, and gently, quietly licked the back of her hand. Ruth flinched, a single breath catching in her throat. "You remembered," she whispered. "So did I." That afternoon. Ruth sat at the kitchen table with her tea finally steeped. She stared at her cup as though surprised by its presence, but this time, she remembered to sip it. Maxwell lay beneath the table, his head resting near her feet. Emily sat on the floor nearby, drawing again. Another sketch of a dog and a girl. Just before dinner, someone knocked at the door. It was Mira Calloway, a woman in her early 60s with a thick braid of black and gray hair and an oversized green parka. Mira was Willow Creek's local nurse and had checked in on Ruth periodically ever since her diagnosis. Sharp-eyed but warm, she carried herself like someone who knew the weight of time and chose kindness anyway. "Just making my rounds," Mira said, offering a container of lentil soup. "Thought I'd see how everyone's doing." Ruth took the soup with steady hands. "We're okay today," she said. Maxwell smiled. "Did he?" Mira raised an eyebrow. "Well, that's something to celebrate." Maxwell peeked around the table. Ears perked. Mira crouched to his level. "You've got good taste. Old boy, these two ladies are treasures." Maxwell didn't move toward her, but he didn't retreat either, and Emily, watching from the doorway, whispered to herself, "I think he's starting to remember who he is." The snow finally returned. Not in heavy blankets, but in soft, powdery layers that made the air smell cleaner and the world quieter. Willow Creek shimmered with light frost in the mornings, and the cabin's windows wore halos of condensation as warmth from inside met the breath of winter beyond. By now, Maxwell had begun to step out of his shadow. Slowly, carefully, but noticeably. He followed Emily into rooms, not close enough to crowd, but always near enough to be there. He still didn't bark much, and his tail wagged only in whispers. But every small change was a mountain moved. Emily noticed everything. This morning, she wore a pink, fleece-lined coat over her favorite dress, the hem a little muddy from where it dragged over the porch steps. Her cheeks were red from the cold, and her mittens dangled from her sleeves by little strings. She twirled in the backyard, sunlight glinting off her boots, humming a tune about pancakes and polar bears. Maxwell was watching. From the edge of the yard, beneath the sugar maple tree whose bare limbs reached out like tired fingers. He stood still, ears alert. The ground was soft, slippery with thin frost. Emily skipped toward the chicken coop, which hadn't housed chickens in years but now held her collection of imaginary animals, ducks, foxes, even a talking raccoon named Mr. Buttons. Then her foot caught on a root half buried beneath the snow. She went down hard. Her mitten flew off. Her knee hit the frozen dirt. The air left her lungs in a whoosh. And for a second, the whole yard was still. Then there was a sound, low, sharp, urgent. Maxwell barked. It was not loud, but it carried weight, the sound of warning, of presence, from the tree line near the fence. A small dog had wandered in. It looked half wild, thin and shivering, its coat patchy and its eyes unsure. A young mutt, probably abandoned, possibly feral. It crept forward, curious, not aggressive, but not friendly either. Maxwell stepped between it and Emily. His body lowered slightly, but his tail raised. He barked again, this time louder, and the other dog stopped, hesitated, then slowly backed away before vanishing into the trees. Emily sat up slowly, tears streaking down her cold cheeks, but a smile tugging at her lips. "Maxwell," she whispered. "You barked." She reached up, wrapping both arms around his thick neck. He stood still, letting her cling, then slowly lowered his head to rest against her shoulder. She buried her face into his fur, half laughing, half sobbing. Inside the house, Ruth had seen it all through the kitchen window. She had been rinsing a mug when she heard the bark, sharp and clear. Her eyes snapped to the yard. She watched the whole thing unfold in frozen seconds, the fall, the bark, the barrier Maxwell became, and then the moment when everything turned soft again. She dropped the mug. It hit the sink and didn't break. Tears welled up before she realized it. Her fingers trembled against the faucet. Her breath caught, not in fear, but in awe. That night, after dinner. The fire crackled quietly. Emily had fallen asleep on the rug, one hand still resting on Maxwell's paw. Ruth stood in the corner of the living room, near an old wooden cabinet she hadn't opened in years. Inside it was a leather-bound sketchbook. The cover was cracked. The pages smelled of dust and ink. Her hand hovered over the charcoal set tucked beside it. It had been 3 years since she'd last drawn, back when her husband died. Her memory had begun to drift, as if grief had opened the window and let the thoughts scatter. Since then, she had stopped painting, stopped sketching, too afraid that she would forget the lines halfway through. But tonight, the need returned, not as pressure, as presence. She took the sketchbook, her fingers surprisingly steady, and sat by the lamp with a pencil in hand. She didn't plan. She didn't measure. She simply let the image fall onto the page. Emily in her pink coat, Maxwell standing beside her, strong and still. Above them, soft winter sunlight breaking through the clouds like gold ribbon. Their shadows fell long behind them, but they stood hand in paw, unshaken. Hours passed. Ruth didn't notice. Her hand cramped, and her wrist ached. But she didn't stop until the last detail was in place, Emily's smile. Not just a curve, but the kind of smile that held trust. When she finished, she exhaled. Then, almost to herself, she whispered, "It didn't leave me." The next morning, Emily found the sketch taped to the wall near the breakfast table. She stared at it for a long time. "Grandma, did you draw this, Ruth?" Pouring tea, turned and smiled. "I think so." Sweet pea, Emily ran to her, arms wrapping around her tightly. Maxwell, from his spot by the hearth, wagged his tail twice, The snow melted quietly that year, as if it too had learned the rhythm of the house on the hill. Spring arrived with slow breaths, petals blooming one by one along the trail, the scent of damp earth returning to the breeze. At the cabin in Willow Creek, everything softened, the air, the mornings, even Maxwell. He no longer stayed curled by the hearth or kept his distance. Now, he moved as part of the house, waking up with Emily, following her to the porch, watching the wind tug at her pink dress. He had become more than a companion. He had become a presence. Steady as the ticking of the old clock above the fireplace, Emily, now 6.5, had taken to calling him my old lion, brushing his fur with the gentlest of fingers. They shared breakfast toast, rain-soaked naps under the porch eaves, and games that didn't need barking or running, just togetherness. She made him necklaces out of dandelions, which he wore with solemn pride. On weekends, they'd explore the edge of the forest behind the house. Emily would collect acorns and odd-shaped stones while Maxwell walked beside her like a quiet guardian. When she stopped to look at bugs or blow on a seed pod, he'd sit patiently, watching the world with eyes that seemed to remember more than a dog should. Inside the house, Ruth's memory came and went like shifting light through lace curtains. Some mornings, she called Emily Clara, the name of her late daughter. Other times, she forgot the day of the week or the name of the town. But she never forgot Maxwell. There was comfort in the way he lay near her feet during tea, in how he walked beside her when her balance wavered on the porch steps. She talked to him sometimes when Emily wasn't around. Simple, broken thoughts, but with the kind of honesty people often forget to give each other. Some days are clearer than others, she whispered once, scratching behind his ears. But you never change. I think you're the glue. It was Maxwell who kept the house whole. His quiet eyes, his warm, steady body, his presence. But one evening, the peace cracked. Emily had been unusually quiet at dinner. She picked at her peas, pushing them into neat circles with her fork, and didn't ask for Maxwell's share of her toast like she usually did. Her cheeks were flushed, and her forehead had a strange sheen. Ruth noticed, even through the fog in her mind. "Are you feeling all right?" "Sweet pea," she asked gently. Emily didn't answer. She simply leaned against Maxwell and closed her eyes. Later that night, when the wind picked up and rain tapped on the windows, Emily stirred in her sleep. Her skin burned hot. Her breath came in uneven little sighs. Ruth stood over her, one hand pressed to the child's forehead, worry flickering behind her tired eyes. "We'll call Mira in the morning," she said aloud. More to herself than to anyone, Maxwell was already beneath the bed, stretched out beside Emily's mattress. He didn't move, didn't sleep, just watched, waited. At one point in the night, Emily murmured something too soft to hear, then clearer. Maxwell. And as if it were a cue he'd been waiting for all his life, Maxwell lifted his head and rested it on her hand. The fever broke just before dawn. The storm passed, and sunlight crept in slowly, gentle and golden. Emily slept deeply, her breath calm. Ruth dozed off in the rocker by the window, a cup of tea gone cold in her hand. Maxwell stayed. When Emily woke mid-morning, the first thing she did was reach for him. Her voice came out dry, soft. "You stayed, didn't you?" He wagged his tail once, thumping the wooden floor. A single soft beat, it was enough. Later that week, Emily began to work on her most important project yet, her book. She cut and folded pages, bound them with yarn, and filled each one with hand-drawn pictures of her and Maxwell. Sometimes Ruth helped label them when her mind was clear. Page after page of shared moments, The day under the porch rain, the bark that saved her, the nap in the field. The last page held a simple sketch. Maxwell curled beneath her bed. One paw reaching toward a small hand above, she wrote in large, looping letters beneath it. Sometimes. Love waits in silence. She called it Maxwell's book and left it on the bookshelf by the fireplace where guests might one day find it. Spring bloomed fully soon after. One morning, Ruth took them both, Emily and Maxwell, down a path she hadn't walked in years. It wound behind the house and into a small wildflower clearing at the foot of the ridge. The spot hadn't changed. The same moss-covered rock in the center. The same soft breeze. "This is where I used to come with my husband," Ruth said, voice soft but firm. Before memory became something you chase." Emily held her hand. Maxwell walked beside them. They sat together on the rock. No one spoke. The wind rustled through the wildflowers. A few bees drifted lazily near the dandelions. Ruth reached out, her hand resting on Maxwell's broad head. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not leaving Emily and for not leaving me." Maxwell looked at her with steady eyes. He didn't bark, didn't move, just blinked slowly, like a promise, and in that clearin', beneath a sky so blue it could break your heart, 3 souls, one small, one aged, one silent, sat in a moment that felt like forever. Sometimes, the greatest miracles don't come with thunder or light. They arrive in silence, in the form of an old dog, a quiet child, or a fading memory that returns just long enough to remind us what love looks like. Maxwell wasn't just a dog, he was a quiet blessing, a gentle reminder from God that no matter how broken we feel, we are still worthy of love, that even in the twilight of life, we can be part of someone's healing, and that sometimes what we give quietly is more powerful than what we shout. In our daily lives, it's easy to overlook these moments, those silent acts of kindness, the ones that go unnoticed but change everything. But if you open your heart, you might find that God places miracles in your path too. Maybe not with fanfare, but with a quiet paw, a soft voice, or the warmth of being seen. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs a reminder that they are not alone. Leave a comment below and let us know your thoughts, or simply write Amen if you believe in love that waits, heals, and never gives up. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of hope and quiet miracles. And may God bless you and your family. Always.